Welcome to week 2, everyone. Thanks for a great first week and a good spirited conversation. I know a lot of you have been trying to kind of pull things together to get started with the summer term, so I appreciate you trying to get everything in on time as well as you could. We have, I think, already begun to confront the challenge of a pretty well-worn road for interpreting Paul's words in Romans that I want our course to challenge, and that inevitably causes a bit of disturbance, instability in the way that we understand this language that for many of us has been very basic to the Christian faith. So I appreciate your generosity in taking up some understandings of this language that are not familiar perhaps or challenging to what you yourself have been formed in your particular part of the Christian community. One particular dimension of that challenge that was prominent this past week and is going to characterize our whole class, and I want to speak to as we get started in this second week, is the political edge to Paul's gospel. Specifically, the way that Paul's gospel is an anti-imperial message and has anti-imperial power. This is something that a variety of you commented has not been typical of the way Romans has been taught to you. And there are various reasons for that, I think, but I hope that our interactions, my responses to many of you in the forums this past week have helped you to see why, if we take the Jewish context of Paul, the scriptures that Paul is drawing on, the history of his people seriously, if we take the way that Jesus lived and died, that he was executed by a Roman authority as an insurgent ruler in an occupied land. Take these matters seriously, it's difficult to avoid the anti-imperial character of the movement represented in the communities to whom Paul is writing, and also characteristic of the gospel that he is teaching them, the gospel about Jesus. Now, as revelatory as that is, I do want us to sort of scrutinize that a little bit because, as you will have gathered from some of my responses, I don't think that merely being anti-imperial or merely expressing the anti-imperial quality of the gospel, the way that it is politically subversive, is itself Paul's point in Romans. And this is where I probably differ a little bit with both Taubes and Elliott from this past week's readings. I think that they're right about that anti-imperial quality to Paul's gospel and to the early Jesus movement that he's writing to, but I'm not sure that they're right about that being the point that Paul has set out to make in Romans itself, because, and this is so important for our class, we have to take the audience seriously in our interpretation of Paul's words to them. Paul has told us specific things about this audience that if we ignore, we'll attribute things to his language that are really not sound interpretations. These are people that are already well established, it seems, in the community of the baptized, which is probably still part of the wider Jewish community in Rome in a variety of ways. They have joined an anti-imperial movement. They know about this. They're familiar with the Jewish past, with the scriptures. And so there's something more that we need to look for in what Paul is trying to communicate, with the particular emphasis on the obedience of faith that he is seeking to foster among these people of Gentile background as himself apostle to the Gentiles. So I hope you'll ponder that, and taking the audience seriously is especially important for this coming week. As I say, Paul has identified in the opening lines of the letter the audience as people of Gentile background. So Paul is not writing primarily to Jewish people, whether Christian or not Christian. He doesn't need to persuade the audience of something that is supposedly wrong with Judaism, despite the fact that many of us have received Romans and the rest of Paul's teaching as pointed supposedly primarily against Jewish ways, Jewish thinking, perhaps Jewish ethnocentrism or something like that. Paul doesn't need to say that to these people of Gentile background as if they were Jews, and nor, by the way, should we assume that the ethnocentrism that a particular stream of Christianity has attributed to ancient Jews actually fits their self-understanding, the way that they pursued their life as the people of God in Paul's time. So there's a lot of questions to be asked about that assumption about Jews that is so common to the Christian tradition, especially in the modern West, and especially among the sort of Euro-American white stream of Christianity that has tended to be so dominant in much of the past that we have inherited in this class. I want to be sure that you're tracking with what I'm saying about the audience of Romans here. The primary audience of Romans, as Paul characterizes them, which is it? Is it a mixed group of Jewish and non-Jewish people baptized into the Messiah? This is what a lot of our commentators present. Or is it people from among the Gentiles who have been baptized into the Messiah? The answer, at least as Paul characterizes the audience, is the second. People from among the Gentiles who have been baptized into the Messiah. Paul doesn't address himself directly in the letter to anyone that he describes as Jewish. So that has all kinds of implications, but first let's look at where we see this the most explicitly in the letter. The very beginning, when Paul is addressing the audience, giving his greeting, identifying himself, saying that through Christ, he and other apostles have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for his name, among whom you too are called of Jesus Messiah, to all God's beloved in Rome. So Paul regards the audience as people among all the Gentiles. Just a few verses later, when Paul is giving a little bit of a narrative of what has delayed him in coming to Rome, he says, "Now I don't want you to be uninformed, sisters and brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, and have been prevented thus far, in order that I might obtain some fruit also among you, just as I have among the rest of the Gentiles." So again, Paul addressing himself to the audience as people from among the Gentiles. And then finally, when he wants to accentuate that they are from the Gentiles, in a part of the letter where this becomes very important, and we'll get to this in chapter 11 later in the course, but he says, "Now I am speaking to you, to Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am therefore indeed apostle to the Gentiles, I glorify my service." So hopefully this clarifies that the audience of Romans, as Paul characterizes them, are people from among the Gentiles. This means that Paul is not teaching in the letter against Jews, against Jewish tendencies, against Judaism. These are very common inferences that the mainstream of the Christian reception of Romans has drawn from the letter and effectively turned its teaching into something that is built on the backs of Jews. Jews that are not Christians, Jews that supposedly need to become Christian in order to be part of the people of God, something like that. And I want to caution us against that because, in fact, Paul is nowhere in Romans teaching against Jews per se or Jewish tendencies. So if you find that sort of creeping out in your interpretations, try to check that impulse and consider again how you might hear the words as addressed to non-Jewish people. Again, people who are now serving the Jewish Messiah, who are serving the Jewish God, who are following the law of Moses in various ways, but doing all of that as people from among the Gentiles, so that the things that Paul is warning them against are not necessarily things characteristic of Jews, but things that seem to be happening among these people from among the among the Gentiles with respect to particular Jewish institutions, the Jewish God, the Jewish Messiah. So with a view to trying to sort of calibrate more carefully our sense of the audience of this letter, and therefore what specific rhetorical purpose Paul has in writing what he writes, I've assigned an article that I want you to pay special attention to this next week. It's called The Politics of Interpretation, the Rhetoric of Race and Ethnicity in Paul. That's the subtitle. It's co-authored by Denise Kimber-Buell and Caroline Johnson Hodge. It's an excellent article, I think, and it challenges head-on this tendency that many of us have inherited to interpret the power of the gospel over against some kind of Jewish ethnocentrism, maybe even some proto-Jewish racism or something like that. And so to understand Paul to be teaching a gospel about faith that is not ethnically particular and therefore supposedly universal, open to all. And so we build our picture of Christian hospitality on the backs of Jews who are regarded in this picture as the people trying to keep most of the world away from God's blessings as if they were only for them. And it's just, it's not true of ancient Jews, as I've insinuated earlier, and this article by Kimber-Buell and Johnson Hodge is going to help us challenge that reception, that assumption that we bring to this letter. This is especially important for particular language that we're going to be wrestling with that relates to the law, that relates to works of the law, circumcision in particular, in this next session of Romans that we have coming up this week. Just to highlight a concern then that I want to elevate in your mind, it's this, related to the audience and our interpretation of Romans. This tendency to imagine that there is some faith out there that is ethnically neutral or culturally neutral, and in that sense innocently open to the universe, universal in that way, I think is as naive as it is common. In fact, all expressions of faith are determined by a variety of particulars that we might understand in cultural, ethnic, and other terms, because everyone embodies faith, including Jesus himself, in a particular place, under particular influences, as part of particular histories. More importantly, perhaps, we would be naive, I think, to imagine that the faith that Paul is teaching is somehow innocent with respect to Jewish commitments. It's quite clear, I think, that Paul is teaching faith in the God of the Jews, that Paul is teaching a certain way of relating to one another that is deeply influenced by the Jewish past and the Jewish hope. And so to imagine that the gospel is about breaking out from all things Jewish into something else, I think is suspect. More importantly, perhaps, when we imagine some kind of ethnically or culturally neutral faith that is supposedly universal and the corrective to something that is particularly Jewish, we find ourselves concealing the particular influences that are being channeled by that supposedly ethnically neutral faith. This is one of the fundamental characteristics of white supremacy historically in the United States, where white Christians have imagined that we were simply propagating God's honest truth straight from heaven in a way that was universal and supposedly for everybody, and not influenced or corrupted by the particular commitments and superiority complex of white people. And that is something that it's time for us to confront. So this means articulating some of the particular ways that people who claim to embody a faith that is universal, open to all, are actually constrained by their own histories, by their own cultures, by their own patterns of thought and life. There just isn't a neat, culturally or ethnically neutral version of the faith to be grasped. So as you'll see from this article that I find to be very helpful, they understand Paul not to be attempting to transcend or minimize, say, Jewish ethnic particulars, but instead they take Paul to be teaching that the ethnic particulars of the Jewish Jesus and the ways of living by faith that Paul is commending, they are cultivating a particular sort of attitude and interaction amidst social difference, not attempting to minimize them. We might say that they're attempting to, these ways of faith are about generous formation of difference, as opposed to pretending that we can move neatly beyond them. Whenever we pretend to do that, I think we're scuttling in powerful differences without naming them. So this article is important to my mind because it is able to raise this crucial issue, but also because I hope that it will give you a much sharper eye as you are reading Romans 1:18 to 2:29 and dealing with a variety of passages that Christians have typically interpreted in a way that builds them right onto the back of Jews. Not incidentally, building on the back of Jews has been one of the core sort of tenets of white supremacy, whether implicitly or explicitly, in the United States and beyond. So I hope you'll be attuned to that as you're reading. The first passage that you'll be looking at in the first half of Response Form 1 deals, that's 1:18 to 32, is one that we have a lot of baggage coming into. I trust there will be much to discuss. I've required the sermon by Martin Luther King Jr. called Paul's Letter to American Christians as a way of, I think, tapping in to the rhetorical purpose that Paul has in this infamous opening section of his argument in Romans. I think King captures well, in a sense, what Paul is up to and what he is saying to the first readers of this letter, and therefore to us as well. So I look forward to hearing how this perhaps enriches your understanding of that difficult passage and all of the questions and difficulties that interpreting Paul by these lights will raise. Look forward to the conversation again this week.